Alana Dorsey was 7 months pregnant, alone at a gas station, when 3 white gang members decided she looked like an easy target. She didn't shout, didn't cry, didn't fight back. Not then. They laughed when she hit the pavement, thinking it was over. But they didn't know her husband. They didn't know he was a Navy SEAL, just home from deployment, or that he was watching the city from the shadows. They thought they'd sent a message. Instead, they started a war. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Late afternoon light stretched long and golden across the sun-bleached pavement of Harlan's Quick Stop, a roadside gas station sitting just off the main highway at the edge of a mostly forgotten town. The lot was quiet, the kind of stillness that made old buildings feel hollow, and the silence around them feel deliberate, like the world had decided to hold its breath. A dusty blue sedan coasted slowly into the station, easing up to the third pump beneath the faded metal canopy. The engine clicked off with a tired groan, and a moment later, Alana Dorsey stepped out. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly, not out of discomfort, but habit. 7.5 months along, her center of balance had shifted, and every step now came with the deliberate grace of a woman used to moving through the world carefully, not timidly. She wore a soft cotton dress stretched over her stomach and a light denim jacket that she left open in the front. A faded band around her wrist had once been her husband's and now served as a quiet anchor, a reminder of how close she was to holding the life they had created together. The breeze was barely there, warm against her skin, carrying the faint scent of old oil, gravel, and hot asphalt. Alana pulled the nozzle from its holster, slid it into the tank, and pressed the worn buttons with steady fingers. She kept her back to the store and the figures near its entrance, not out of fear, but from a practiced awareness. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the most deliberate thing a person could wield. 3 men leaned against the wall just past the automatic doors, beneath the grimy store signage that had lost most of its letters over the years. Cal Brewer stood at the center, arms crossed, and one boot planted against the base of a stacked display of firewood. His arms were tanned and scarred, a jagged inked cross disappearing beneath the frayed edge of his sleeve. He wasn't loud, but he didn't have to be. Cal's presence was the kind that shifted air, quiet, watchful, and heavy with intent. To his left and right stood the Wheeler twins, Mick and Grady, nearly identical in build and dress, from their matching leather vests to the untied boots that scraped faintly against the ground as they shifted in place. They were talking just loud enough for their voices to carry, murmurs that slipped in and out of clarity. "She ain't from around here," Grady said, lifting a cigarette to his mouth with one hand while gesturing lazily with the other. "That's city skin. Soft, dressed up like it belongs." Cal didn't look at Alana directly, but the curve of his mouth hinted at something sour beneath the surface. "Bet she thinks she can just walk in. No problem. New rules, right? Everyone gets to feel safe now." Mick smirked as his gaze followed the line of Alana's back. "She looks like she's got something cooking. Maybe we should ask who the daddy is. Could be any of us if she's got the nerve to show up here like that." Grady chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "You know the type. Thinks respect is automatic just 'cause she waddled in pregnant." Alana's face didn't flinch, not even when the pump clicked loudly to signal a full tank. She hung the nozzle back in place, closed the fuel door with a light touch, and reached into the back seat to grab her small purse. The gospel station she'd been listening to played softly inside the car, a woman's voice lifting praise between static and fading reception. She turned and began walking toward the store entrance. Cal shifted his weight slightly, catching her movement with the edge of his vision. The others straightened just a bit, not in greeting, but in challenge. The door's motion sensor had been broken for weeks and didn't respond until she was almost directly beneath the overhang. Before she could reach it, Mick took a step forward, just enough to block the path in a way that might have seemed accidental, if not for the pointed stillness that followed. "Afternoon," he said, not with politeness, but the kind of flat familiarity that scraped like gravel. "Sure is warm for someone that far along to be out running errands." Alana stopped a foot short of him. Her voice was calm, low, and measured. "I'm going inside. That's all." "Funny thing," Grady added, leaning in a little with a crooked grin. "A lot of people think this is just a regular old gas stop, but folks around here know who it belongs to." "Used to belong to," she said, without looking at him. "Now it belongs to the company that fixed your busted pump, and the cameras you thought weren't working." Grady's smile disappeared. Cal stepped forward. Not quickly, not aggressively. Just enough to let his body do the talking. "Nobody said you couldn't shop," he said, watching her closely. "We're just trying to figure out when folks stopped waiting their turn and started walking in like they run the place." "I didn't know waiting came with skin conditions," Alana said, her tone flat and unapologetic. "But since I'm here, and you're standing in the way, I'll ask nicely once." She stepped forward again. Cal's arm slid across the doorframe, blocking the motion sensor completely. His face didn't move, but the weight in his eyes shifted. "You don't get to tell me what to do. Not out here." Alana's gaze dropped to his arm, and then back to his face. She didn't raise her voice, didn't step back. "I'm not telling you anything. I'm walking past you. That's it." Grady muttered something under his breath. Mick laughed, a tight, bitter sound that didn't match his smile. And then, without warning, a shove. It wasn't dramatic. Not a punch. Just enough of a push to send her weight shifting too quickly over unsteady ground. Her foot slid across a patch of spilled oil near the edge of the walkway. Her hand reached out instinctively for the frame of the door. She didn't find it. The sidewalk caught her full on the side. A sharp cry escaped her lips. Not pain, not yet, but surprise and alarm. And her arms instinctively cradled her belly as her body twisted with the fall. The concrete scraped against her hip and shoulder as she hit the ground. But it was not the pain that locked her breath in place. It was the silence that followed, the weighted hush between her body and the sky, as though the world itself had frozen to see what came next. Gravel dug into her palms as she tried to lift herself, one elbow trembling beneath the weight of her own body and the second heartbeat she'd carried for 31 weeks. Above her, the gang hadn't moved yet. Cal stood closest, arms slightly raised, like he wasn't sure whether the fall counted as his or gravity's doing. Grady hovered behind him with an expression that flickered between amusement and tension, and Mick gave a short, uneasy laugh that didn't match the grim line of his mouth. Alana blinked once, forcing the blur from her vision, her cheek burning where it had scraped the pavement. Her hand pressed against her belly, feeling for movement, for anything that might tell her she was still carrying life, and not just memory. She lifted her eyes, and then she spoke. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a cry for help or mercy. Her voice was clear and even, layered with contempt so pure it cut through the air like broken glass. "You needed 3 of you to shove a woman down," she said slowly, her lip trembling but her words intact. "And that's still the most any of you have ever accomplished." Cal's expression shifted. Not a flinch, just a stilling, like something inside him had gone suddenly quiet. Grady gave a sharp, barking laugh. "Well, would you look at that? She's got teeth. You sure that thing inside you belongs to your man?" Mick added, crouching slightly, sneering at the sight of her holding her belly. "Might not even be his. Might be one of us. And you're just mad he left you with it." Alana's breath hitched, but she didn't look away. "All this, just because you know you don't matter without the fear. without people like me keeping you angry enough to feel tall. It was too much. Cal stepped forward and dropped his knee straight into her side, driving the full weight of his body into her abdomen. The air fled her lungs in a single helpless wheeze. Her back arched from the shock, her mouth opened, but no sound came. She tried to roll away, but Mick's boot came down hard on her lower back, pinning her in place. "Look at that," Mick said, his voice tight with breathless excitement. "Thought she was something." Grady stepped up then and kicked her square across the ribs. The sound was solid, final, a thud that echoed in her bones more than her ears. Her arms wrapped tighter around her stomach, trembling hands pressing down as if she could protect the child that hadn't even taken its first breath. But pain was blooming everywhere now, dull in some places, sharp in others, each jolt leaving her weaker, each second threatening to steal the last thread of consciousness. Cal leaned over her, his breath hot against her ear as he crouched. "I should crush that thing inside you," he said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact, like he was discussing a chore. "Save the world from another one of you." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Just a strained gasp that scraped against her throat and vanished into the heat around them. Her arms, still wrapped around her belly, trembled violently as she tried to shift, to move, to make herself small enough that the pain might pass her by the next time they came in swinging. But her limbs no longer obeyed with certainty. Each breath she drew was borrowed, shallow and stuttering, like her body was already beginning to give up on itself. Cal's words still hung in the air, thick, vile, and irreversible. "I should crush that thing inside you," he'd said, as if what she carried was some threat, some offense to his sense of order, and not the last pure thing she had in this world. She wanted to respond, to strike back with something sharper than the boot print already forming across her spine. But her voice was gone now, buried somewhere beneath the thunder in her head and the fire spreading through her ribs. "I bet it's not even his," Grady said, stepping forward again, his boots scuffing against the edge of her dress. "Bet she got involved with some charity case, and now she's acting proud like it means something." "She was walking like she mattered," Mick muttered, still standing over her, his voice heavy with mockery. "But now look at her. Ain't even fighting back." Alana moved, barely. Just a slight shift of her hand, her palm dragging along the gravel until her fingertips found the thin strap of her purse. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a shield. But it was hers. And in that moment, having hold of anything felt like a lifeline. "Still trying?" Cal asked, almost amused. "Still think you can hold on to it?" He stood. The sun caught the metal buckle of his belt as he took 2 steps back. Not in retreat, but in preparation. There was no hesitation in his movement, no drama, no need for words. He simply drew back his leg and kicked her once more, full force, into her lower side. The sound wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The moment it landed, her entire body curled involuntarily, folding in on itself with a sickening shudder. Her forehead slammed against the ground. Her legs twitched, her mouth opened in a silent cry, and her hands clutched her belly so tightly her knuckles went white. Something deep inside her shifted. She felt it. Not just pain, but absence. The sensation was unmistakable. She had been hurt before in her life. She had known fear, known exhaustion, known grief, but never had she felt her body betray her so completely. Never had she felt something so precious slip from her grasp without a sound. There were no tears, no screams, only the tight, collapsing breath of a woman who knew in that moment she had just lost everything she had spent months building her hope around. Mick exhaled sharply, almost startled by the violence of the last strike. Even Grady hesitated, his smirk faltering for just a second. But then Cal turned away, satisfied, wiping the sweat from his brow with the edge of his shirt, like he had just finished a workout. Nothing more. "That's enough," he said, voice flat. "She ain't getting up from that." Mick shifted his stance as if realizing, too late, that the last kick had gone further than any of them expected. His bravado thinned for a moment, not from guilt, but from the kind of hollow discomfort that came when brutality passed a line and left no room for laughter to fill the space. Still, he said nothing. Grady cast one last look down at her, not with concern or remorse, but with the narrowed gaze of a man who didn't like what silence felt like after violence. Her body wasn't moving. Her arms stayed coiled tightly around her midsection. Her head, half turned toward the sky, gave no sign that she was conscious anymore. There was blood now, more than they expected, a thin trail slipping from the corner of her mouth, joining the widening smear beneath her ribs. Grady cleared his throat and jerked his chin toward the truck. "We're done here." Cal had already turned away. He moved without a second glance, his boots crunching over the scattered gravel as he approached the driver's side door. He wiped the last of the sweat from his forehead with the hem of his shirt, then flicked it back down and climbed into the cab like he was finishing a chore. His movements weren't rushed. He knew no one was coming. Not for her. Not for them. Mick opened the passenger door and slammed it shut behind him. "Bet she won't forget this lesson," he said with a grin, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Might not remember it either, depending on how hard we knocked her." Grady laughed at that, a shallow, nasal sound, and climbed into the back seat. "One less problem walking around this town acting like she owns the pavement." "She got what she deserved," Cal muttered as he started the engine. The Dodge roared to life with a growl. Its frame shuddered once before rolling backward in a wide arc, wheels skimming the edge of the sidewalk as they swung out onto the road. As the truck accelerated away, Mick leaned out the window, one arm resting on the doorframe, and shouted something unintelligible behind them, more mockery than words, more venom than thought. Laughter followed, loud and shrill, trailing behind them in uneven bursts, the kind of laughter meant to mask what their guts were already wrestling with. As the tail lights disappeared over the hill at the edge of the service road, the sound thinned and vanished with them, swallowed by distance, leaving nothing but heat, silence, and a body broken under the weight of 3 men who believed no one would come looking. Alana lay still. She was aware of the world only in fragments now. The shimmer of heat rising from the pavement in front of her eyes, the quiet buzz of the street lamp overhead, the slow, sticky warmth of blood tracing the curve of her chin and pooling at her shoulder. Her arms refused to move. Her legs twitched, not with purpose, but with the confused signals of a body struggling to process trauma. Her breaths were no longer steady. They came in gasps, jagged and wet, caught somewhere between her lungs and throat, as though every breath might be her last. The waiting room at St. Adeline Memorial was nearly empty, as though the night had agreed to spare the staff one less tragedy, until now. Fluorescent lights buzzed low overhead, too bright, too steady, their unflinching glow casting long reflections against the tile floor. A nurse moved briskly across the corridor, her sneakers squeaking faintly with each step, while a receptionist murmured instructions into a phone that barely pierced the hush pressing against the walls. Tyrone Dorsey stood just inside the doorway of the emergency wing, his uniform still sharp from transit, his boots dusted from the base parking lot, his duffel bag forgotten in the back of a borrowed government SUV. He didn't speak. He didn't ask for directions. He didn't look lost. He simply stood there for a long, silent moment, as if some unseen signal had flickered across the air and confirmed what no words yet had. The call had come 2 hours ago. Unidentified woman, black. late pregnancy, assault victim, listed as critical. He had not asked questions. He had just driven. Now, as the nurse spotted him and moved to intercept, clipboard in hand, her voice softened before it even left her throat. "Are you Mr. Dorsey?" He nodded once. "Please come with me." The hallway was long, sterile, and silent. They passed 3 closed doors, a pair of whispering nurses, and a portable gurney pushed to the side. The door at the end of the hall stood open. A soft, rhythmic beeping came from inside. Tyrone's footsteps made no sound, but each one felt louder in the gravity of that corridor. When he stepped into the room, his chest didn't rise. He didn't take a breath. He didn't blink. Alana lay on the hospital bed, her face swollen and bruised, her lip split in 2 places, and one eye nearly closed from the impact of a strike that hadn't stopped with her falling. Her arms rested above the blanket, an IV snaking from one wrist. A small oxygen mask lay askew across her cheek, and the monitor beside her counted each fragile heartbeat with clinical indifference. A nurse inside adjusted her chart and slipped out without a word. Tyrone stepped closer. He took in everything. The bruises darkening her neck, the cuts trailing down the side of her jaw, the bruising across her arms where she must have tried to shield her stomach. But his eyes didn't move to her belly right away. They hovered at her hand, still curled faintly inward, as if clinging to something that wasn't there anymore. The doctor entered behind him, her expression composed, but lined with exhaustion. "She's stable," she said softly. "There's no internal bleeding, and she's breathing on her own." But Tyrone's gaze didn't move. "The trauma," the doctor continued, pausing only once. "It was too much. We did everything we could." "But the baby!" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Tyrone didn't flinch, didn't ask for details, didn't sit. He simply stood there, the silence around him growing thicker, not empty, but charged, as though something vast and unseen had just shifted inside him and would not shift back. The loss settled not in his eyes, but in the stillness of his stance, the way his fists slowly curled at his sides, the way his shoulders drew back, not from pain, but from purpose. The doctor waited for a question, an emotion, even a flicker of acknowledgement. There was none. Eventually, she stepped back and quietly left the room. Tyrone remained by Alana's side until the monitor's rhythm steadied into a slower pace, the signal of her body returning from the edge. He reached down and adjusted the oxygen mask gently, not like a man tending to someone fragile, but like someone returning something to its rightful place. Then he turned and left. Outside, the air had cooled just enough to sting. The lights in the lot had that washed-out halo that only came from fatigue and grief crashing into each other. Tyrone walked past his parked vehicle, past the exit, and down the sidewalk where the glow of the hospital no longer reached. He pulled his phone from his jacket, dialed one number without looking, and raised it to his ear. It rang once, then picked up. "Tyrone?" "Kendrick," he said quietly. His voice didn't waver. "I'm ready." He ended the call without waiting for a reply. The night remained quiet, but not for long. The diner sat at the edge of a forgotten stretch of road just outside the city's center, far enough from streetlights and patrol routes to be left alone, close enough that it could watch the heartbeat of the town without being noticed. The chipped neon sign above the roof blinked unevenly, casting a soft red glow over the cracked concrete steps and faded picnic benches outside. Inside, the booths were worn, their cushions patched with duct tape, the walls lined with faded newspaper clippings and photographs that hadn't meant anything to anyone in at least a decade. Tyrone stepped through the door like he had done it 100 times before, though the woman behind the counter had never seen his face. Her gaze flicked up briefly, but something in the way he carried himself silenced the usual small talk. He didn't order. He didn't slow. He walked straight to the back booth where two people were already waiting, seated opposite each other. The weight of their shared years etched into the space between them. Officer Kendrick Moss sat on the left, his badge clipped low to his belt, and half covered by a plain brown windbreaker. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and the bags under his eyes said more about the job than any rank ever could. Across from him, Detective Kenya Rollins sat with a posture too clean to be comfortable, shoulders drawn back, fingers tapping slowly against the edge of a manila folder that hadn't yet been opened. She wore plain clothes, but nothing about her felt unremarkable. Her eyes followed Tyrone all the way to the seat, assessing him without blinking. Tyrone slid into the booth without speaking. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sharp, measured, like a blade being drawn slow and deliberate across stone. Moss was the first to speak. "I heard what happened. I'm sorry, Tyrone. I truly am." Tyrone nodded once, then looked at Kenya. "You know what this is," he said, voice even. "You know what they did." Kenya tapped the file once, then pushed it across the table. "We've been watching the Wheeler boys for 3 years. That includes Cal Brewer and 6 others tied directly to them. Stash houses, muscle, runners. The problem is they're protected. Every time we move, the case folds before we can even write a warrant. Judges stall. Prosecutors back out. And too many of their foot soldiers are ghosts. No IDs, no prints, no paper trail. They got people in the mayor's office," Moss added, rubbing the back of his neck like the thought physically weighed him down. "Cousins in real estate, nephews in zoning, donations flowing to the right campaigns. Every time we get close, someone pulls a thread, and it all unravels before we can grab hold." Tyrone opened the folder and scanned the photos inside. They weren't blurry. They weren't vague. Faces, names, timestamps. Mick and Grady Wheeler unloading crates behind a mechanic's shop. Cal leaning into a tinted car window at the edge of a bar lot. Surveillance stills from a liquor store. A body camera image smuggled through an off-the-record source. "What if we don't ask for permission?" Tyrone asked, eyes still on the photos. Kenya sat forward. "Define don't ask." "We take what they trust," Tyrone said calmly, closing the folder. "We hit them where they live, where they stash, where they talk. We make them panic. They'll start turning on each other. They'll bury themselves." Moss leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "And what happens when they start hitting back?" "They will," Tyrone said. "But not before they lose the places they feel safe. And by the time they come up for air, they'll have left enough behind to finish them." Kenya was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "If we're doing this, we do it smart. No noise, no splashes. We log everything. Every move gets documented and tied to something clean. You take point on the ground. We handle the trail. Agreed?" Tyrone didn't hesitate. "Agreed." The next 3 days unfolded like reconnaissance in a hostile country. They mapped the patterns. Kenya provided times, cross streets, license plates. Moss traced the false IDs through city databases that hadn't been updated in years. They found the stash houses first. Modest buildings in hollow neighborhoods, guarded not by locked doors, but by the arrogance that no one would dare challenge them. Tyrone watched for hours before moving. The first hit came before sunrise. The house was quiet, the lights still dark, the men inside asleep or stoned into stillness. Tyrone bypassed the front entirely, circling to the rear where the fence had rotted beneath the weight of weeds. He moved silently, crouched low in tactical gear that bore no insignia, no flag, nothing to trace. He disabled the back camera with a short jab of his blade, eased the door open with quiet hands, and stepped into the hallway before a single floorboard had time to creak. The first man never saw him. The second woke just long enough to glimpse a shadow slipping past the doorway before the butt of a rifle knocked him clean into darkness. Inside, the place was worse than the pictures. Ammunition crates beneath the kitchen table. 2 rifles on the couch. Drugs bagged and sealed in clear rows. No locks, no guards, just entitlement. Tyrone didn't touch the drugs. He didn't steal or destroy. He photographed everything. He swept the room for intel. He slipped out the front door and disappeared into the pre-dawn haze before the street even stirred. Kenya arrived an hour later with a forged tip and a warrant from a judge who didn't realize what she was signing. The sun had barely crested the rooftops when the unmarked SUV came to a stop half a block from the now-abandoned stash house. Its tires rolled slow, deliberate, not even kicking dust as they slid into place along the curb. Inside, Kenya Rollins kept her posture tight, one hand on the dash, the other clutching a clipboard that held the forged call record, carefully backdated to line up with a non-existent tip. The uniformed officers who joined her later were just props. They followed her lead, swept the perimeter, and went through the front door without resistance or urgency. The inside of the house was quiet, too clean, too vacant, like someone had left in a hurry but taken nothing with them. But the evidence had been left untouched. Rows of small bags, cash stacked tight and low behind a false panel, ammunition boxes tucked under a stained mattress. Kenya called it in as textbook. She let the city's press hear what they needed to. Drugs and firearms seized in a neighborhood no one cared about. Another small win for law enforcement. But the people who cared the most weren't in the press rooms. They were in the warehouse 10 blocks away, where Cal Brewer stood with his arms crossed, lips pressed into a line, eyes locked on the metal table in front of him, as Mick and Grady Wheeler circled like animals sniffing the edge of a snare. "They didn't take $1, Mick said, pacing back and forth. "Not a single bag, not even one of the guns." "That don't sound like a junkie hit." Grady leaned on a crate of stolen copper wire, eyes narrowed, jaw twitching. "And the cops, they show up an hour later with a perfect damn warrant. Somebody knew. Somebody tipped them." Cal didn't move. He stared at the table for a long time, unmoving, and then finally turned his head slightly toward the wall, where a corkboard sat half-filled with Polaroids and handwritten schedules, deliveries, shifts, expected drop times. It wasn't law enforcement who should have had that house mapped to the minute. It was them. "You think we got a rat?" Mick asked. Cal didn't answer right away. His silence spoke louder than agreement. The room tensed. "What about the new kid, Eli?" Grady suggested. "Started hanging around the night runs, asking too many questions." "Eli's too dumb to be the leak," Cal said flatly. Mick spat on the floor, his voice tight with frustration. "Then who? Because someone's feeding them clean intel, and it sure as hell ain't coming from our side." Cal turned to the board, his finger tracing a delivery route from the gas station to the chop yard, then down toward the warehouses by the docks. "We move the rest tonight. All of it. Every crate. Every pill. We go dark for a week. Anyone doesn't like it, they can take a walk." Mick frowned. "You think going quiet's gonna fix?" "I think," Cal interrupted, voice low and sharp enough to cut the air, "someone just declared war without saying a word. And I don't fight loud. I fight clean." Across the street, in a rusted-out truck parked behind an overgrown fence line, Tyrone Dorsey watched the tension unfold through a borrowed long-lens camera. He didn't need to hear the words to know exactly what was happening. The movement, the shouts, the sudden change in posture, all of it painted a picture he'd seen too many times in places halfway across the world. Fear had entered their house. Not because someone had attacked them in broad daylight, but because something had been taken that they couldn't track. Control. Routine. assurance. Those were the foundations their power was built on. The moment one piece cracked, the rest would begin to shift. He sat still, shoulders relaxed, not because he was calm, but because stillness made people disappear. From behind tinted glass, he watched Mick kick over a chair and storm out of the room. Grady followed a few minutes later, cursing into his phone. Cal remained behind, motionless again, arms crossed as he studied the board like it owed him answers. They were hunting shadows now. That's what he wanted. Tyrone turned the lens slightly, scanning the adjacent building, noting license plates, shift changes, routes in and out. He cataloged everything, not because he planned to hit them now, but because the right moment would only come once, and when it did, there would be no margin for hesitation. The air hung heavy as the city slipped into darkness, not the kind of quiet born of peace, but the stillness of a place waiting for something to snap. Somewhere beyond the warehouses and back alleys, the Wheeler crew began to fracture beneath the weight of its own secrecy. Calls were made, cars rerouted, meetings rescheduled and scrambled. Cal's orders had been sharp. Shut down operations for 72 hours, no drops, no pickups, no chatter, but paranoia had a way of making men feel trapped inside silence. Kenya moved first. She fed the city's most notorious defense attorney a sliver of information, an unsigned report about a gun found in a property tied to one of the gang's shell companies. She didn't name names. She didn't have to. The attorney, known for protecting the Wheeler crew, panicked quietly. Within hours, he reached out to an assistant district attorney with a half offer of cooperation that would later vanish just as fast. But the damage had been done. Whispers began to curl inside courtrooms and offices, whispers that someone, somewhere, had started flipping pieces of the puzzle. Meanwhile, Moss made another kind of move, less public but equally surgical. He requested internal records on a city waste contract used to launder gang money, knowing full well it would ping on someone's desk. It didn't take long. The following day, a contact inside zoning reported that a white SUV had been parked outside Moss's home for 3 hours without moving. Tyrone, watching it all from the periphery, saw what he needed to see. They were off balance, and that's when he turned his attention back to the people who mattered. Alana had been discharged 4 days earlier. Her body had healed enough to walk, to dress, to eat in short, quiet bites that filled the room with nothing but the sound of silverware against ceramic. But her voice, once warm and full of gentle fire, had narrowed into a kind of silence that didn't retreat. It settled. She moved like someone who'd been dropped into a life that no longer recognized her, eyes lingering too long on nothing in particular, hands folding and unfolding themselves around cups of tea she never finished. Tyrone stayed close, but gave her space. He cooked when she didn't ask, watched her without pressing, and when the room went quiet, he never asked about the child. She never brought it up. They lived in the pause between sentences that never got said, the air between them filled with too much history and not enough breath. Late one evening, as the sky folded into a deep navy and the streets began to empty, Tyrone stepped out the back door and walked to the edge of the property, where a rusted pickup sat crooked behind a leaning fence. It wasn't one of theirs. It belonged to a man named Joel Trebb, low-level transport runner, barely trusted, but useful for smuggling goods between towns under the radar. Joel didn't know he was being watched. He thought parking in neutral corners kept him invisible. Tyrone approached the vehicle like he would a live wire. He crouched low, pulled a soft cloth from his jacket, and slipped under the chassis in a single smooth motion. The night carried just enough wind to hide the sound of the screwdriver as he loosened the panel beneath the cab. His fingers moved with precision, placing the tracking device deep in the undercarriage where the signal would remain strong but hidden from quick inspections. He sealed it, wiped down every bolt, then slipped out the way he came, silent, clean, and unseen. As he walked back through the alley, however, movement flickered near the dumpsters. He paused, weight shifting subtly, breath slowing. A figure stepped out from the shadow, stocky, mid-30s, wearing a black leather vest unzipped over a faded hoodie, a silver cross swinging from his neck. Tyrone recognized him instantly. Denny Lask, one of Cal's enforcers, known for his fists and little else. "You lost?" Tyrone asked, voice calm, measured, with no need to raise it. Denny grinned, cracked his neck once, and stepped forward. "Funny. I was about to ask you the same thing." Tyrone tilted his head slightly, calculating distance. There were no witnesses, no lights close enough for cameras, just the narrow alley and the quiet. "I've seen you," Denny said, circling a little now. "Snooping around places you don't belong. Someone said you showed up right before the house got hit. I must have one of those faces." Denny chuckled. "You got a mouth on you for a guy standing in the dark with nowhere to go." Tyrone didn't respond. He didn't need to. Denny lunged first. He came in fast, swinging with his right, sloppy but full of weight. Tyrone slipped the punch with a shift of his shoulders, caught Denny's wrist mid-motion, and twisted hard enough to drop him to one knee. The pop of the joint came sharp and clean. Denny howled and swung upward with his left. Tyrone blocked it with his forearm and drove his elbow into Denny's throat. Not enough to crush, just enough to silence the shout. The fight was ugly after that. Denny pushed forward, grabbing at Tyrone's shirt, trying to use bulk and momentum to slam him against the wall. Tyrone let him come, shifted at the last second, and sent Denny crashing into the dumpster. The metal echoed through the alley. A cloud of sour air burst from inside. Before Denny could turn, Tyrone hit him once in the side of the head, open-handed, but with enough force to rattle his balance, and followed with a knee to the ribs. Denny collapsed forward, coughing hard, arms trembling as they tried to find the ground. Tyrone stepped back, eyes cold, chest rising steady. "You don't know me," he said quietly, crouching just low enough for Denny to see his face clearly through the haze of pain. "You don't know what I've done, or who I've buried, and you don't know what you took from me, but you're going to." He stood, wiped his hands on his jeans, and disappeared into the dark as fast as he'd come. Behind him, Denny lay coughing blood into the gravel, his eyes wide with something he hadn't felt in years: fear. Not because he lost, but because whoever just broke him didn't even look angry. The retaliation came not as a warning, but as a message wrapped in fire and glass. At 3:18 a.m., the front porch of Harlan's Market, a corner store owned and operated for 23 years by Elijah Benton, a retired Army cook and one of Moss's oldest friends, was lit up like a signal flare. A Molotov cocktail sailed through the air with the arc of something rehearsed, something practiced by hands too comfortable with violence. The glass shattered against the wooden rail, and in the seconds that followed, the flames spread with unnatural speed. The fire licked up the siding, crawled across the roof like a living thing, and wrapped itself around the porch beams until the entire storefront glowed in shades of orange and black. Inside, Elijah's teenage nephew had been sleeping on a cot near the back office. He woke coughing, stumbled out barefoot, and got clear just before the second bottle hit. The building didn't collapse, but it was gutted by morning. Walls blackened, shelves scorched, smoke staining the ceiling like ghost fingerprints. The footage, pulled from a grainy security cam across the street, showed a van with no plates and 3 men in masks moving fast. They didn't speak. They didn't hesitate. They came to burn, and they left without looking back. By sunrise, Word had spread through the precinct and the street. This wasn't just a warning. It was retaliation. Inside the makeshift operations room they had turned Moss's back office into, Kenya stood stiff-backed, pacing near the whiteboard, while Tyrone calmly studied a map on the far wall. The silence between them was stretched thin, the kind that came not from disagreement, but from two opposing storms waiting to break. They targeted Elijah, she said flatly. They went after someone who wasn't part of this. That boy could have died. Tyrone didn't turn. But he didn't. That's not the point. It is to them. Kenya moved closer. This isn't war, Tyrone. Not the kind you're trained for. You don't get to operate with no oversight. This is public now. People are watching. They started that fire because they're afraid, he replied without raising his voice. You don't set fires when you're in control. You do it when you're trying to smoke out a threat you can't see. She narrowed her eyes, the weight of everything pressing hard against her ribs. Then we pause. We regroup. We use this moment to gather intel, not throw more gasoline on a fire we can't contain. Tyrone finally turned. His gaze was steady, calm, anchored in a grief so deep it had passed through anger and come out on the other side as something colder. They already started the war, he said. I'm not pausing. Kenya didn't respond right away. She studied him for a long moment, then exhaled and stepped back. Her silence, not approval, but surrender to momentum she could no longer redirect. The next target wasn't a stash house or a runner. It was a warehouse just off the river, owned on paper by a holding company, but known in their circles as one of Cal's personal drop sites. The kind of place that didn't move product often, but when it did, it moved large. Kenya's files included blueprints, delivery schedules, and infrared footage taken over several weeks. Tyrone took that data and walked the perimeter in person, noting the gaps the drone hadn't caught, the shifting patterns of guards who believed they were too deep in shadows to be seen. He waited 2 nights, watching as the rotation thinned, and then made his move. There were 2 guards outside, both armed but relaxed. One smoked, the other scrolled through his phone. They didn't see Tyrone coming. He came in low, silent, a shadow among shadows. The first guard didn't even lift his head before a quiet strike to the neck dropped him flat. The second turned too late and found himself gasping for breath. His pistol stripped and tossed into the alley before he could even raise it. Inside the warehouse, the lights were off, but the air was heavy with the scent of oil and plastic wrap. Crates lined the walls, unmarked, sealed tight, but filled with guns, pills, and counterfeit cash. Tyrone didn't take a single thing. Instead, he marked crates, placed tiny adhesive tags near their hinges, and pulled memory cards from 2 poorly hidden cameras. He left no signature, no prints, no visible damage. But by morning, the building was already crawling with Wheeler crew. Cal arrived just before dawn, stepping out of a black SUV with a scowl carved deep into his face. He didn't speak as he walked through the aisles. He didn't need to. The men around him moved nervously, checking crates, whispering guesses, arguing over whether it was a break-in or a bad delivery. No one noticed the absence of product, because nothing had been stolen, and that made it worse. Cal stood in the middle of the floor, staring up at the catwalk that lined the top of the structure, eyes scanning the space like he could smell whoever had walked through it. He didn't bark orders. He just stared until the silence thickened into dread. Later that day, Kenya confronted Tyrone near the water, where he stood watching the current roll beneath the train bridge. She didn't speak for a while, just stood beside him, hands buried in her coat pockets, her eyes following the flow downstream. You keep pushing like this, there's not going to be a gang left to prosecute. Just chaos, fear, violence in all directions. That's what they gave her, Tyrone said quietly. And when it's over, then what? He turned to her then, the muscles in his jaw tight, his gaze unreadable. "I want to bury them," he said, in a silence they can't explain. Kenya looked away, eyes tracing the horizon, as if hoping the river might carry the weight of what was coming. And in the distance, at the edge of the warehouse district, a white van had just pulled into the alley behind a church-run community center. Inside were two men with bruises on their knuckles and soot on their jackets. Men who didn't know their next move would be the first one that sealed their end. The sky was overcast that morning, the kind of thick gray that muted the colors of everything it touched. The grass looked dull, the trees more skeletal than they had in days, their thin branches barely stirring in the soft wind. The small cemetery sat just beyond the edge of the neighborhood, tucked behind a chain-link fence with a rusted gate that creaked when pushed open. The ground was still soft from the rain the night before, damp soil clinging to every step, like it hadn't yet decided to let go of the weight left behind. Alana Dorsey moved without haste, her posture composed but marked by the kind of quiet that followed a storm no one else had heard. She wore a charcoal-gray coat that hung just past her knees, the belt cinched loosely at the waist, sleeves slightly long, hands tucked inside with fingers curled around a small bundle of fabric. She hadn't come to talk. She hadn't come to pray. She had come to place something where it no longer had a home. When she reached the narrow plot marked by a low stone no taller than her shin, she stopped and stared down without kneeling. The grave bore no name, no inscription of life or dates, just a clean, simple line chiseled in muted relief across the face of the marble. Loved without breath. There were no flowers, no trinkets, just damp earth, the flattened impression of past visits, and the solemn silence of a life that never had the chance to speak for itself. Alana slowly removed her right hand from the coat and unfolded the blanket she had been holding, a soft, pale blue square that still carried the faint scent of baby lotion and home. She lowered herself to one knee with quiet care, pressing the cloth gently against the stone before smoothing the corners with her palm. Her touch lingered just long enough for the breeze to lift the edges slightly before falling still again. She didn't cry. Her face held no expression of outward sorrow, but the silence around her deepened as if the earth itself recognized what was being surrendered. She stood, adjusted her coat, and turned away from the grave without a backward glance. Her footsteps moved slowly along the worn path back toward the road, gravel crunching faintly beneath her boots, the weight of her loss trailing just behind her, but never fully out of reach. What she didn't see, at first, was the black SUV parked just beyond the cemetery fence, angled half toward the road like it had stopped but hadn't yet decided whether to stay or follow. Cal Brewer leaned against the driver's side door, his arms folded across his chest, posture relaxed, but the sharpness in his gaze gave him away. He watched her move with the eyes of a man who had expected something else, regret, fear, maybe even collapse, and found himself unsettled by the quiet resolve in her stride. When she passed by the edge of the fence and stepped onto the sidewalk, he pushed off the car and followed. His boots hit the pavement with deliberate slowness, and his voice followed close behind her shoulder, low and heavy with mock concern. "Didn't expect to see you out here so soon," he said, his tone feigning familiarity, while his steps narrowed the distance between them. "Figured after what happened, you'd know better than to wander off alone." Alana kept walking. Cal didn't. He matched her pace for several strides, moving close enough that she could hear the scrape of his jacket against his jeans. The subtle edge of threat nestled beneath each word he let spill into the space between them. "I mean, I get it," he continued, voice steady. "Some folks don't know when to stay down. They take a hit, they think they can just get back up and pretend nothing changed. But you got the kind of face that makes people think twice." makes them remember. Alana's pace didn't change. Her chin lifted slightly higher now, eyes focused on the path ahead, every part of her refusing to react in the way he clearly hoped she would. "You think this little walk makes you strong?" he asked, the bite behind the words finally rising. "You think showing up like this means something?" And then he stopped. Not because she had turned or spoken, but because something shifted behind him. A presence, silent and unmoving, settled into the air with such certainty that it made Cal's body go still before his mind caught up. He turned slowly, not in panic, but with the cautious awareness of a man whose instincts told him the balance of power had just shifted. Tyrone Dorsey stood less than 10 feet away. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply watched. His hands were loose at his sides, his stance neither wide nor aggressive, but there was something in the stillness of his presence that made every muscle in Cal's shoulders tighten at once. His expression held no fury, no need to assert dominance, only a calm that felt far more dangerous than any threat spoken aloud. Cal swallowed once, his breath hitching just enough to betray him. The weight of Tyrone's gaze didn't waver, and though no words passed between them, the message was carved deep into the silence. This would never be allowed again. Cal backed away slowly, his boots retreating step by step toward the SUV without a sound. He didn't glance at Alana, didn't mutter anything further. His bravado had wilted in the space of a few seconds, and when he reached the vehicle, he climbed in with hands that didn't shake, but moved just a little too quickly to be confident. Tyrone remained where he stood until the SUV turned the corner and vanished into the long row of trees. Only then did he step beside Alana. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. They walked the rest of the way in silence, the kind that wasn't awkward or restrained, but shaped by the shared understanding of people who had both been pushed to the edge of something irreversible. The air in the safe house had thickened, not with smoke or dust, but with the weight of information too potent to ignore. The gang runner they'd flipped, Julius, a lanky kid barely out of high school with shaking hands and a busted lip, sat slumped in the corner of the room, head low, eyes flickering with the exhausted tension of someone who had just stepped over a line they could never uncross. Kenya stood near the wall, arms folded, her gaze sharp as glass, as she replayed his statement aloud, piece by piece, ensuring the words held up under pressure. Grady and Mick weren't just hustling guns and moving product across county lines anymore. According to Julius, they had leveled up, organizing a deal that extended beyond state borders, a trafficking pipeline disguised under shell corporations and burner companies. The shipment scheduled for pickup wasn't small. It was significant enough to require armed transport, falsified manifests, and a payout that would move millions once it cleared. Kenya didn't flinch when she said it, didn't dramatize or exaggerate. She simply laid the file open on the table, maps and intercepted messages arranged like pieces of a net tightening around the gang's leadership. Tyrone stood across from her, unmoving, the creases in his shirt still pressed from the morning, his eyes flicking between the photographs and the notes without a single word wasted. Moss paced slowly behind them, the uneven rhythm of his steps a quiet percussion against the hardwood floor. He hadn't slept much, not since the retaliation at Lenny's shop left flames curling up the walls and a lifetime of hard work nearly reduced to ash. That fire hadn't taken a life, but it had drawn a line in the sand. The message had been sent loud and clear. Back off, or the next one won't be so clean. But none of them were backing off. When Kenya closed the file and looked up, Tyrone didn't ask for options. He gave only one word: intercept. No vote was needed. No plan B was drawn. Within hours, the location had been confirmed, the time synchronized, the equipment packed with clinical precision. It wasn't a government-sanctioned op, but it moved with the same discipline, each person locked into their role, No room for second-guessing. The target was a converted freight hub on the edge of the industrial district, its security a thin blend of bribes and assumptions, its cover so tight they thought they were invisible. But they weren't invisible to Tyrone, not after the routes had been mapped and the players identified. They weren't invisible to Kenya, who had traced every bank transaction that didn't make sense until the full picture had come into view. And they weren't invisible to Moss, who had once walked those streets in uniform, shaking hands with men he now knew had been bought years ago. The operation hit just past midnight, when the last shift change had passed, and the trucks were being loaded under the cover of silence. Tyrone moved first, his approach ghost-like, his timing exact, disarming two guards with swift, controlled motions that left them alive but confused, their radios yanked before they could speak. Kenya followed with a team of two, cutting power to the rear lot, cloaking the far side of the building in a wave of darkness. Moss entered through the side corridor, a tactical flashlight low and steady, sweeping each hallway with the caution of a man who had seen too many good plans fall apart from impatience. Inside, the cargo was still being logged. Crates packed with illegal firearms, boxes marked with fake barcodes, containers stacked with enough narcotics to poison a city block. But it wasn't just product they found. Beneath the floorboards of the supervisor's office, Tyrone uncovered something far more dangerous. A locked steel case containing 3 burner phones, 2 encrypted USB drives, and a bound leather ledger marked only with the initials VC. Kenya snapped on gloves and cracked the first phone open. The messages were coded but dated, running back nearly 3 years, with references to weekly deposits, coordinated drop points, and payoffs tied to badge numbers. Not street names, but identities buried inside the system. She moved faster after that, scanning the ledger, matching initials to known aliases, her lips tightening as the threads began to connect. By the time she reached the end of the book, the confirmation came not from the last page, but from what had been folded inside it. A photocopy of a municipal badge ID. Deputy Chief Harold V. Colton. Kenya didn't speak right away. She stared at the page for several long seconds, her hand steady, her breathing measured, but her jaw locked so tight it looked as though she were holding back something volcanic. Moss, who had been checking the remaining crates, turned when he saw the change in her expression. She handed him the paper without ceremony. He read it once, then again. And when he looked up, his voice wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of weight that silence couldn't ignore. I trained under that man. The admission didn't change anything, but it cracked something. Not in Moss's loyalty, but in the history that had once guided it. The man who had shaped his early years in uniform, who had signed off on every commendation, every suspension, every off-the-record reprimand, had been the same man laundering money through the very gang that had nearly burned their city from the inside. Tyrone looked at him without pity, without shock, but with the shared recognition of someone who had long ago stopped assuming that the uniform meant honor. He nodded once, then turned back to the room, his attention already moving toward the implications of what they'd just unearthed. This wasn't just about retaliation anymore. It was about exposure, and they were nowhere near finished. By the time dawn unfolded across the quiet lanes of the city, casting a pale gray light over storefronts still shuttered and sidewalks still slick from the mist, the balance had already begun to shift. The gang, once certain in their dominance, started grasping at threads they couldn't trace, calls that rang endlessly without answer, contacts who no longer returned favors, doors that once opened with ease now closed without explanation. There was no single moment when control was lost, no defining blow that signaled defeat, but the erosion had begun, and it was silent, steady, and relentless in a way they had never prepared for. Inside a dim garage tucked behind a rusted-out auto shop on the edge of town, Cal paced with the intensity of a man whose grip was slipping. His shoulders rolled with tension, his boots scuffed dark trails into the oil-stained concrete, and his fists opened and closed at his sides like pistons searching for release. The informant they had once trusted, young, wide-eyed, over-eager, was now a ghost, found face down in a dry creek bed behind Millstone. No sirens had come, no lights, no outrage. His death wasn't a message to the city. It was a message to them, and it had failed. Mick sat in the corner of the room, head low over his phone, fingers twitching with unease as he sent message after message to law enforcement allies, street-level connections, and old favors that no longer responded the way they once had. The usual phrases, coded but familiar, had lost their power. Now the language was overt, blunt, panicked, as if dressing desperation in subtlety was no longer worth the time. Every reply came slower, some not at all, and none of them brought reassurance. What Mick couldn't have known, what none of them yet understood, was that every single word being spoken was captured. The phones were no longer theirs. The lines they thought secure had long been compromised. Kenya had laced the data stream days earlier, rerouting signals through untraceable ghost nodes, every incoming and outgoing ping feeding into her encrypted vault like a river collecting silt. She had learned to read their rhythms like a heartbeat. When they were most anxious, when the threats came too quickly, when silence screamed louder than words. This wasn't surveillance. It was orchestration. And the real symphony began with Grady. He had been assigned a simple task: pressure a councilman known to speak a little too freely on late-night radio shows, the kind who believed his title gave him just enough armor to nudge at the gang's influence without consequence. Grady arrived sloppy, high on overconfidence, not knowing that the storage unit next to that office had been wired wall-to-wall just 2 nights earlier by Moss and Tyrone. The two men hadn't spoken much as they calibrated the receivers and set the recorders, their movements efficient, practiced, and without hesitation. They didn't need to talk. They already understood what would happen. When Grady stepped into the building and started mouthing off, rattling off council names, using phrases like vote insurance and monthly fee, they caught it all. Every sneer, every thinly veiled threat, every chuckle laced with contempt. He had no idea he was laying his own grave in real time. The recording didn't go to the authorities. It went somewhere better. Kenya uploaded the trimmed, enhanced file to a temporary cloud server, stripped metadata, anonymized the source, and sent it to a local journalist with a reputation for exposing corruption and a long-standing grudge against the city's failure to protect its black residents. The journalist didn't hesitate. By mid-morning, the audio was running on every major channel and being passed around social media feeds like wildfire. What had once been whispers became headlines, and Grady's voice, once barked with impunity in the shadows, now echoed across every household that cared to listen. There was no deniability, no angle left to spin, no silence that could hold against the weight of that voice, admitting what so many already knew but hadn't heard so plainly before. By the time the first wave of media descended on City Hall, the mayor's office had already issued a carefully worded non-statement. But the damage wasn't political, it was personal, and the most powerful blow hadn't even landed yet. The next city council meeting, normally sleepy and procedural, was packed shoulder to shoulder with reporters, concerned citizens, activists, and quiet, watchful figures from agencies who had stayed uninvolved until now. The room buzzed not with shouting, but with that expectant stillness. The kind of hush before a verdict, before a storm. That was when Alana entered, her steps slow but unwavering, her face calm, not blank, just composed in a way that demanded the room meet her on her terms. She wore navy, deep, unyielding, standing beside Tyrone without touching him, but never drifting from his side. She didn't address the room. She didn't need to. Her presence alone, bruises faded but not forgotten, said everything that needed to be said. Across the room, Cal saw her. The moment his eyes found her, something shifted. Not visibly, not to anyone else, but Tyrone caught it. The flicker of recognition, of discomfort. The kind of dread that creeps in when the thing you thought was gone stands in front of you again. Unbroken. Alana didn't lower her gaze. She didn't soften. She didn't flinch when murmurs rippled through the crowd, or when phones rose to capture her face. She just stood. Cal hesitated, his bravado thinning under the weight of a silence he couldn't command. He looked away first, jaw tight, shoulders braced, but unwilling to confront what she represented. The ghost of what they tried to erase. The living proof of their failure. Tyrone didn't speak. He didn't move. But in the brief glance Cal gave him before turning away, there was no mistaking what passed between them. It wasn't anger. It wasn't threat. It was inevitability. And this time, there would be no exit. The mechanic's yard was bathed in the muted glow of fading sunlight, casting long, distorted shadows over rusted metal frames and cracked concrete surfaces stained with decades of oil and neglect. Tyrone stood near the yard's center, breathing steadily. The quiet around him not comforting, but heavy, thick with the weight of a history that had been left unresolved for far too long. It was the kind of silence that gathered in a place accustomed to pain, where stories ended harshly, and justice was more often whispered than shouted. Not far away, Officer Kendrick Moss sat quietly in his unmarked car, hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, eyes distant and focused on something that had happened years before, a memory still sharp enough to cut. He had been younger then, his badge shiny and new, his uniform crisp with idealism. It was an evening much like this one, darkening skies, streetlights flickering to life. He had been on patrol when he heard the cries, urgent pleas muffled by cruel laughter. He saw the assault clearly, recognized the cruelty etched on the faces of the gang members who towered over their victim. A young black man whose only crime had been walking the wrong street at the wrong time. Moss had moved to intervene, his hand on the radio to call for backup, adrenaline surging with the urgency to protect. But senior officers, ones who had trained him, men he had once admired, had appeared from nowhere, their faces calm, eyes detached, telling him to stay back, to let it play out. "You can't stop everything, Moss," one had said, placing a firm hand on his chest. "Some things you have to let happen. It's how things stay balanced." He'd never forgotten that moment, never forgotten the way his blood had run cold, never forgotten how he'd stood there helplessly as those officers allowed brutality to proceed unchecked. For years he had carried that memory like an anchor, the weight growing heavier with every injustice that slipped quietly past, without acknowledgement, without reckoning. He had waited too long, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the balance might finally shift. Across town, Kenya Rollins stood in the cramped office of the precinct's records room, her fingers carefully sorting through files that held too many stories, too much pain, too little justice. Her movements were meticulous, precise, driven by a memory equally painful and fresh. Her cousin, a bright-eyed college freshman who dreamed of medical school, had once walked these same city streets, smiling, unaware that his path had already been marked by those same ruthless men who controlled the corners, the gang whose grip on the city had gone unchecked far too long. When he was killed, his death was reduced to a cold file, buried deep within a system uninterested in justice, marked merely as collateral damage in a war that authorities preferred to pretend didn't exist. "I won't let them erase you," Kenya whispered softly, placing her hand atop the thick stack of paperwork. Her resolve hardened further, eyes clear, steady. This paperwork wouldn't disappear. Not this time. This was more than personal. It was essential. She was tired of watching lives reduced to faded documents and buried files. Back in the mechanic's yard, Mick finally stepped out from the shadows, his gaze locked onto Tyrone with the wary tension of a man who knew his time was running out. He approached slowly, each step deliberate, trying to mask his apprehension beneath a veneer of false bravado. "Came here alone?" Mick asked, a sneer twisting his face into something ugly and defensive. "That doesn't seem smart, Navy man." Tyrone didn't move immediately, his expression unreadable, calm as the surface of still water. When he spoke, his voice carried no anger, just quiet certainty. "Smart isn't why I'm here, Mick. I'm here because someone has to finish what you started." Mick lunged abruptly, his fists swinging wide and wild, desperation driving his movements. Tyrone reacted instinctively, sidestepping the assault, hands quick and precise, redirecting Mick's momentum so that he crashed into a pile of rusted engine parts. Metal clattered loudly, sending echoes ringing sharply off the yard's concrete walls. The fight erupted then, fierce and unforgiving, brutal in its immediacy. They exchanged heavy blows, Mick's punches driven by panic and fury, Tyrone's counterattacks fueled by disciplined anger and a precision honed in combat. Blood spattered onto the ground, droplets mixing indistinguishably with oil and dirt. Mick grabbed a heavy wrench, swinging it violently toward Tyrone's head, the metal grazing his shoulder in a flash of pain that sharpened his focus even more clearly. With relentless calm, Tyrone pivoted, striking Mick's wrist sharply, disarming him with a methodical precision. Another blow to Mick's jaw sent him reeling backward, stumbling against the hood of a rusted pickup, gasping for breath. Tyrone moved in swiftly, gripping the collar of Mick's jacket, forcing him to face the consequences that waited just beyond this moment. "You can't outrun what you did, Mick," Tyrone growled, his voice even, relentless. "You won't bury this. Not ever again." Mick didn't answer, not with words. He spat blood to the side, wiped his mouth on the back of his hand, and snarled with the defiance of a cornered animal. His fist flew upward, catching Tyrone off guard with a knuckle-bone hook that slammed into the side of his face, rattling bone and bursting skin just beneath his eye. Tyrone staggered back a half step, blood already warm on his cheek, blinking past the sting. But he didn't fall. He didn't retreat. "You think you're better than us?" Mick roared, charging again, his shoulder lowered, aiming to drive Tyrone back into the metal framework of a dismantled lift. The collision was thunderous. Tyrone's spine cracked against the steel beam behind him. The wind pushed forcefully from his lungs, but even as pain spidered down his back, he dropped low, pivoted, and grabbed Mick by the front of his coat, twisting his weight with brutal momentum. The throw wasn't elegant, but it was devastating. Mick landed hard against the cracked pavement, dust and gravel grinding into his skin. He tried to rise immediately, but Tyrone was already there, one knee braced on his chest, fist raised high. The first punch landed with a dull, sickening thud. The second was worse. Mick's head snapped sideways, blood streaking from his nose, his mouth already swelling. He still didn't stop. He kicked up hard, catching Tyrone in the ribs, and scrambled free, rolling across the ground and reaching blindly for the first weapon he could find. His hand closed around a jagged piece of exhaust pipe, maybe 18 inches long, black with soot and rusted at the edge. He swung it in a wild arc, missing Tyrone by inches, the metal whistling past his shoulder. Tyrone advanced with care now. No hesitation, just the poise of a man who'd fought for his life in tighter corners than this. He ducked under the next swing, caught Mick's wrist, and twisted until joints popped and the pipe clattered away. But before he could follow through, Mick rammed his head forward again, a second headbutt cracking across Tyrone's already bloodied cheekbone. This time, Tyrone went down on one knee. Mick seized the moment, straddling him, fists pounding down. The blows were raw, full of panic and hate. "You should have stayed buried overseas," Mick hissed between grunts. "Should have died like the rest of them." Tyrone didn't answer. He took the hits, let the pain sharpen him, ground his foot against the pavement for leverage, then drove upward with all the force he had left, his forehead smashing square into Mick's chin with a bone-jarring crack. Mick reeled, dazed, and Tyrone surged up from the ground like a storm unleashed. 3 punches, fast and heavy, broke through whatever defense Mick tried to throw up. One to the stomach, folding him. One to the throat, choking him. One to the temple, dropping him. Mick collapsed against the tire wall, coughing, face slick with blood, ribs rising and falling like a collapsing tent. "You think I came here to beat you?" Tyrone asked, wiping blood from his own jaw, his voice rasping but clear. "I came to end what you started at that gas station. That woman you laughed at. She's the reason you're not dead right now." Mick blinked slowly, dazed, unfocused. Tyrone stepped closer, crouched, grabbed his collar again. "You see, I wanted you to feel this. The fear, the breath you can't catch, the pain, because she felt it. And still, she stood. And I'm not leaving until you know exactly what it means when someone stands back up." Behind them, tires screeched softly on the gravel outside. Red and blue lights cast flickering halos across the yard. Moss stepped in first, sidearm raised, his face grim but measured. Tyrone stood, breathing hard, blood still trickling along his temple. Mick tried to crawl. Moss walked over, cuffed him hard, wrenching both arms behind his back without ceremony. "You're done," Moss said, his voice cold, a lifetime of restrained fury carried in that single phrase. "You don't get to disappear. You don't get to vanish behind some paperwork. Not anymore." Kenya appeared behind him, clutching the sealed warrants, eyes locked on Mick's broken face. Her lips didn't move, but the look she gave him told him everything. He'd become part of the system he helped poison, and now that system was finally turning on him. As the officers dragged Mick toward the waiting car, Tyrone stood still, every joint aching, every muscle burning, but his posture unbroken. This wasn't victory. It was survival wrapped in justice, and it had been earned the hard way. The noose had tightened, and now it held. The precinct's cramped evidence room felt smaller than ever beneath the dim overhead lights, a tense silence filling every corner of the space as Kenya Rollins hunched forward, her fingers moving rapidly across the keys of an old laptop. The screen illuminated her face with a soft bluish glow, highlighting the tight lines around her eyes, her expression focused, driven by a determination born from years of buried frustration finally surfacing into clarity. Beside her, Moss paced quietly, his breathing steady but burdened, eyes frequently darting to the door as though expecting an interruption at any moment. Behind them, Alana sat patiently, her composure calm but edged with quiet intensity, her gaze carefully studying each symbol on the laptop screen as Kenya fought with the encryption. The USB they had recovered from Mick's arrest, an innocuous-looking drive that held far more secrets than any of them could have anticipated, resisted all conventional methods of decoding, its layers of security dense and sophisticated. Kenya exhaled softly in frustration, shaking her head slowly, fingers momentarily paused above the keyboard. "I've tried every code breaker we have," Kenya murmured quietly, glancing toward Alana, her tone respectful yet hesitant. Whoever built this encryption knew what they were doing. Alana leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. She extended her hand gently. "Let me try," she said softly, without urgency, her voice steady with a quiet confidence that drew Kenya's attention instantly. Kenya hesitated only briefly, then passed the laptop over, watching carefully as Alana began to work with steady precision, her fingers effortlessly maneuvering through sequences of complex algorithms. The room grew quiet again, filled only with the gentle hum of the laptop's processor and the rhythmic tapping of keys. Minutes passed slowly. Each one weighted heavily with anticipation until finally, without fanfare, Alana stopped typing, leaning back slightly with a quiet exhale. On the screen, a file opened, revealing neat rows of carefully recorded data. Names listed clearly alongside payment amounts, addresses, and meticulous notes. Alana's voice was quiet, but steady when she finally spoke, breaking the silence gently. "It's done." Kenya leaned forward, eyes wide as she absorbed the information now laid bare before her, the reality settling heavily upon her. Moss stepped closer, standing just behind her shoulder, his breathing deepening slightly as he scanned the screen, each entry painting a clear and chilling picture. City leaders, deputies, prominent business owners, each name meticulously documented alongside contributions that had funded the gang's terrorizing presence, with notes detailing the systematic plan to displace black residents and reshape entire neighborhoods. Kenya shook her head slowly, disbelief edging her voice with quiet anger. "This wasn't just crime," she whispered, voice hardening with every word. "It was policy." Moss moved back slowly, a deep frown etched across his face, his eyes clouded with anger and something darker, more personal. "They used our badge," he murmured bitterly, the realization cutting deep into his sense of duty and trust. "They took everything we stood for and twisted it." Tyrone had been quiet until then, standing near the back of the room, observing without comment, his silence an anchor in the swirling storm of revelations. Now he stepped forward slowly, his eyes calm but deeply intent on the screen. His gaze traveled carefully over each name, each payment, each address, seeing more clearly with every second the scope of what they faced. "This wasn't just about the baby," Tyrone said quietly, the weight of understanding settling deeply into his voice, quiet but resonant. The gang was a front. They weren't just attacking individuals. They were clearing the board for something bigger. His finger paused abruptly near the end of the document, the final entries listing someone whose involvement none of them had anticipated. Judge Raymond Culver's name appeared clearly, alongside detailed notes showing how he had systematically facilitated the gang's objectives from behind his bench. Dismissed charges, lenient sentencing, plea deals quietly arranged, investments carefully hidden beneath legitimate ventures, purchasing properties cheap from desperate families, fleeing gang intimidation. Kenya stared at the screen in stunned silence, her breath caught in a tight knot in her chest. "Judge Culver," she whispered incredulously, her voice barely audible, carrying the disbelief of someone betrayed deeply by a trusted figure. He played both sides. Moss sank into a nearby chair, his expression visibly shaken, the revelation striking deep and personal, unsettling the foundations of his trust. He struggled to find words, his voice strained with conflicted emotion. "That man gave the eulogy at my sister's funeral," Moss finally admitted, his words quietly heavy, echoing deeply with the betrayal of someone he had believed to be beyond reproach. The room fell into a deeper quiet, the gravity of Culver's betrayal sinking deeply into each of them, each processing the truth differently. Tyrone, however, stood unmoved, his expression unchanged, the same steady resolve reflecting clearly in his eyes. He stepped closer to the laptop, leaning forward slightly, examining the details with clinical detachment. "We take him too," Tyrone stated simply, without hesitation, his voice clear, firm, definitive. "Nobody's exempt from this. Everyone involved pays." Kenya met his gaze, silently acknowledging the truth of his words. Moss hesitated, clearly struggling with the emotional weight of what had been revealed, yet he knew Tyrone was right. The betrayal hurt deeply, personally, yet Moss understood, perhaps better than anyone, the necessity of confronting even the deepest betrayals head-on. The line had been crossed too far. Forgiveness was no longer a viable option. Judge Culver knew exactly what he was doing, Tyrone continued quietly, looking at Moss with understanding but uncompromising firmness. He manipulated the system, betrayed the trust we placed in him. He's complicit, just as guilty as anyone else on that list. This ends now. Moss nodded slowly, reluctantly, his acceptance coming hard, but finally complete. "You're right," he admitted quietly, his voice heavy but determined. "We can't let this slide. He must face consequences like everyone else." Alana reached out gently, placing her hand reassuringly on Moss's shoulder, silently acknowledging the depth of his struggle, offering quiet support. Kenya carefully copied the encrypted list, securing the data meticulously, ensuring no part of it could disappear or be compromised, aware more than ever how critical every piece of evidence was now. As the gravity of what they'd discovered settled fully into the room, a silent understanding passed between them, a silent resolve, shared determination that justice would finally, irrevocably be served. No more excuses, no more hiding. The truth had finally emerged, stark, undeniable, and the city's reckoning had only just begun. The warehouse loomed ahead, a monolith of steel and concrete nestled within the industrial sprawl of the city's forgotten outskirts. Its exterior bore the wear of years, yet the fortified fences, surveillance cameras, and guarded entrances spoke of its current, clandestine purpose. Inside, it functioned as the gang's financial heart, a laundering hub where illicit gains were cleansed and funneled into legitimate fronts. Tyrone, Kenya, and Moss stood concealed in the shadows of a derelict building across the street, the glow of the warehouse's security lights casting long, distorted silhouettes. Each carried the weight of the mission ahead, their expressions a blend of determination and the steely calm of those who had faced danger before. Kenya adjusted the strap of her backpack, the tools within ready for the digital warfare she was about to wage. Moss checked his sidearm, the familiar weight a reminder of his years in the force, now turned against those who had corrupted it. Tyrone surveyed the perimeter, his mind mapping out the assault with the precision of a seasoned operative. "We move on my signal," Tyrone murmured, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of machinery. "Kenya, once we're inside, head straight for the server room. Moss, you're with me. Neutralize any threats and secure the main floor." They nodded in unison, the plan etched into their minds. With a final glance exchanged, they slipped into the night, approaching the warehouse with the silent grace of predators closing in on their prey. At the rear entrance, a lone guard stood, his posture relaxed, unaware of the storm about to descend. Tyrone approached swiftly, dispatching him with a precise strike that rendered him unconscious before he could utter a sound. Kenya disabled the security panel, her fingers dancing over the keys with practiced ease, and the door slid open silently. Inside, the warehouse was a labyrinth of corridors and storage rooms, the air thick with the scent of oil and metal. They moved with purpose, each step bringing them closer to the core of the operation. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered and died, plunging the interior into darkness. Kenya had initiated the power cut, a prelude to the chaos that would follow. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in a crimson glow, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. From the depths of the warehouse, the sound of hurried footsteps and shouted commands echoed, a sign that their presence was now known. Tyrone and Moss pressed forward, engaging the first wave of guards with lethal efficiency. Fists met flesh, and the air was filled with the sounds of combat as they carved a path through the opposition. Kenya reached the server room, its door secured with a biometric lock. She retrieved a device from her pack, attaching it to the scanner. Within moments, the lock disengaged, and she slipped inside, the hum of servers greeting her. She set to work, fingers flying over the keyboard as she initiated the data purge, erasing the digital footprints of the gang's operations. Back on the main floor, Tyrone and Moss faced a formidable adversary, a towering enforcer whose sheer size was matched only by his brutality. The fight was intense, a brutal exchange of blows that tested their limits. Tyrone utilized his agility, weaving between the enforcer's attacks, while Moss delivered calculated strikes, exploiting every opening. Together, they brought the giant down, his fall shaking the ground beneath them. With the path cleared, they regrouped with Kenya, who had completed her task. "Data's gone," she confirmed, her voice steady. "They won't be laundering anything through here again." A sudden noise drew their attention. A door at the far end of the corridor burst open, and Cal and Grady emerged, weapons drawn, their expressions a mix of fury and desperation. The final confrontation was at hand. Tyrone stepped forward, his gaze locked onto Cal. "It's over," he declared, his voice echoing through the corridor. "You can't hide behind your money or your connections anymore." Cal's sneer twisted into a snarl as he raised his weapon, but before he could act, a shot rang out. Moss had fired, the bullet striking Cal's hand, causing him to drop his weapon with a cry of pain. Grady lunged forward, but Tyrone intercepted him, their bodies colliding in a violent struggle. The fight erupted then, fierce and unforgiving, brutal in its immediacy. They exchanged heavy blows, Grady's punches driven by panic and fury, Tyrone's counterattacks fueled by disciplined anger, and a precision honed in combat. Blood spattered onto the ground, droplets mixing indistinguishably with oil and dirt. Grady grabbed a heavy wrench, swinging it violently toward Tyrone's head, the metal grazing his shoulder in a flash of pain that sharpened his focus even more clearly. With relentless calm, Tyrone pivoted, striking Grady's wrist sharply, disarming him with a methodical precision. Another blow to Grady's jaw sent him reeling backward, stumbling against the hood of a rusted pickup, gasping for breath. Tyrone moved in swiftly, gripping the collar of Grady's jacket, forcing him to face the consequences that waited just beyond this moment. "You can't outrun what you did, Grady," Tyrone growled, his voice even, relentless. "You won't bury this. Not ever again." Grady snarled defiantly, spitting blood onto Tyrone's sleeve, his desperation morphing into reckless aggression as he suddenly lunged forward, slamming his forehead violently against Tyrone's temple. The impact exploded with blinding intensity, sending a sharp, white-hot jolt of pain tearing through Tyrone's vision, causing him to stagger momentarily, releasing his grip just long enough for Grady to wrench free. Taking advantage of the fleeting opportunity, Grady threw a frantic punch into Tyrone's ribs, landing with enough force to draw a ragged breath from deep in Tyrone's chest. Pain surged through his side like molten lead, but Tyrone's instincts, honed from years of warfare, propelled him back into motion immediately. He turned fluidly, delivering a hard elbow strike to Grady's throat, forcing him backward, choking and gasping, eyes wide with sudden panic. But Grady was cornered and desperate, his instincts reverting to raw survival, adrenaline pushing him past rationality. Snatching up a length of rusted chain from the cluttered workbench nearby, he swung it wildly, the heavy links whipping through the air, slicing brutally across Tyrone's forearm, tearing fabric and flesh in a sudden burst of crimson. Tyrone recoiled briefly, the sensation searing and jagged, yet it only heightened his resolve, pulling him further into the zone of controlled rage. Ignoring the sting, Tyrone advanced again, his movement precise and lethal, dodging the chain as Grady swung again, the metal missing by mere inches, crashing into the side of an abandoned vehicle with a deafening clang. Tyrone closed the distance, grasping Grady's wrist with calculated force and twisting sharply until the chain fell from Grady's grip, clattering uselessly onto the oily ground. Grady roared in frustrated agony, lunging again, tackling Tyrone into the metal shelving stacked haphazardly with greasy engine parts. They collapsed together, bodies tangled, wrestling fiercely amid the debris of broken tools and twisted metal. Grady reached desperately for a nearby screwdriver, his fingers wrapping around the handle, thrusting it upward toward Tyrone's chest in a vicious, final effort to kill. Tyrone reacted instantly, blocking Grady's wrist inches from his heart, muscles straining with the sheer exertion of resisting Grady's frenzied strength. Locked in a brutal, trembling stalemate, Tyrone summoned every ounce of his strength and training, driving his knee upward sharply into Grady's exposed ribs. The audible crack echoed through the yard, and Grady gasped sharply, his grip faltering, allowing Tyrone to force the screwdriver away. With his opponent momentarily weakened, Tyrone pushed off the debris-strewn floor, hauling Grady upright and driving him forward relentlessly into the hard edge of a metal workbench. The impact shook the bench violently, scattering bolts and nails across the ground. Grady groaned in pain, yet still fought blindly, grabbing for Tyrone's throat in a last, feeble attempt to choke out his victory. Tyrone countered instantly, twisting Grady's wrist painfully, causing Grady to yell hoarsely as his hand went limp. Without pause, Tyrone landed a series of precise, punishing blows to Grady's face, each strike calculated, relentless, until Grady's eyes grew glassy, his legs weakening beneath him. Blood flowed freely down Grady's face, mixing with sweat, dripping onto his shirt as he swayed unsteadily. Tyrone finally gripped Grady's collar again, pulling him close, his voice harsh and unwavering. "This isn't just about me, Grady," he said sharply, eyes blazing with fierce intensity. "This is for every person you ever terrorized, every life you tried to ruin. You'll never outrun their voices. They're coming for you, even if it's through me." Grady's defiant glare flickered with uncertainty and finally crumbled entirely as the sounds of approaching sirens filled the mechanic's yard, the wail growing louder and closer with each passing moment. Tyrone held Grady firmly, watching as flashing red and blue lights cascaded through the chain-link fencing, flooding the scene with stark, unforgiving illumination. Moss was first through the gate, his expression stern yet deeply satisfied, his eyes briefly meeting Tyrone's with understanding forged through shared struggle. Uniformed officers followed closely, weapons drawn but held steadily, their movements swift and decisive as they surrounded Grady, cuffing him securely, reading his rights with mechanical precision. Kenya appeared just behind Moss, a determined expression etched onto her face, holding the documents she had painstakingly prepared, each page secured and accounted for. She watched closely, knowing too well how easily justice could slip away into darkness. She had prepared for this moment, ensuring every piece of evidence would hold firm against pressure or corruption. Tyrone stepped back slowly, watching as Grady was pulled roughly to his feet and led toward the waiting squad cars. The sirens gradually faded into silence, but the weight of what had just occurred lingered heavy and profound, pressing down upon them all. Tyrone exhaled slowly, the adrenaline fading now, replaced by a quiet, resilient resolve. As Grady was driven away, Kenya approached Tyrone quietly, her voice steady, but carrying the emotion of personal triumph and relief. "He won't walk away from this," she assured, looking directly into Tyrone's eyes. "I made sure every report, every detail, every single word sticks. No one can erase this, not anymore." Tyrone nodded slowly, acknowledging her words with quiet respect. Moss joined them, his expression somber, thoughtful. The lines of his face deepened by years of frustration and restraint finally breaking through. "It's taken too long," Moss murmured quietly, his voice thick with unspoken regrets. "Years of watching this city drown in fear, knowing men like him were protected, hidden in plain sight. But tonight, we finally broke that chain." Kenya laid a gentle hand on Moss's shoulder, understanding passing silently between them. "And we'll keep breaking it until there's nothing left to hide behind," she promised firmly. The mechanic's yard slowly emptied, leaving only the quiet whispers of what had happened there, the echoes of a confrontation years in the making. Tyrone stood with Moss and Kenya for a long moment, their silence no longer one of helpless waiting, but of measured certainty. A promise that justice was not just a hope. It was finally a reality taking form, tightening steadily around those who thought themselves beyond reach. The courthouse steps had never borne the weight of so many truths unveiled at once. Weeks had passed since the final raid, but the shock waves it unleashed continued to ripple across every corner of the city. A city once ruled from the shadows was now being forced into the light, one name at a time. The news coverage hadn't slowed. If anything, it had gained momentum, swelling with each indictment, each unsealed affidavit, each testimony that traced the gang's influence like a rot through the walls of public trust. People no longer looked at the city's leadership with passive familiarity. They looked with suspicion, with awakened scrutiny, and most of all, with memory. They remembered the silence after each murder, the lack of answers after each eviction, the endless excuses after every lost son, brother, or neighbor. Now, the silence had cracked. Grady and Mick were the first to go down. Their charges ranged from drug trafficking to aggravated assault, extortion, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism. The evidence Kenya secured, paired with Tyrone's groundwork and the surveillance Moss had built over years of quiet resistance, formed an unbreakable chain. There would be no plea deals, no last-minute favors. The court froze every asset linked to the shell businesses they operated, seized their vehicles, and demolished the warehouse within days of the verdicts being announced. Cal, though slower to fall, eventually met the same fate. His lawyers fought with venom, calling the charges politically motivated, even daring to cast him as a victim. But the city wasn't listening anymore. They had heard his voice on the leaked calls, mocking the pain of his victims. They had seen Alana's bruised face on the courthouse camera, standing beside her husband without flinching, and they had watched the tears of the store owners and displaced families who testified before a grand jury with the kind of grief that could never be rehearsed. His bail was denied, his sentencing hearing loomed, and few believed he'd ever walk free again. But it didn't end with them. The list Alana had decrypted became a roadmap, not just to crime, but to complicity. Judge Raymond Culver's name echoed like a betrayal across every channel the day his arrest was announced. A black man, a respected elder, once praised for his calm voice and deep roots in the community, now faced federal racketeering and obstruction charges. Years of decisions were pulled into review. Plea deals he had granted to gang members were re-examined. Old cases reopened. He sat stone-faced during the hearing, flanked by lawyers who had once campaigned on his endorsement. Kenya watched from the gallery, her jaw clenched as the list of allegations was read aloud. The man who had given the eulogy at Moss's sister's funeral, who had shaken hands at school fundraisers and spoken about community strength. He had sold all of it, bit by bit, for control, for capital, for quiet power. "You think he'll flip?" Kenya had asked Moss quietly afterward. Moss shook his head slowly. "Men like him don't flip. They just fall." The politicians were next. Council members with offshore accounts. Developers who profited from the displacement of black neighborhoods. Even a deputy mayor whose campaign was tied directly to ghost donors connected to the gang's laundering operation. Kenya and Moss had gathered names and timelines. Federal prosecutors had moved quickly after the evidence was authenticated. Some resigned before charges landed. Others vanished entirely. But most were arrested without spectacle, taken from their homes in the middle of the night, booked quietly, as if the city was trying to distance itself from the shame as quickly as possible. But it was too late for distance. The public had seen too much. Protests, once fragmented and silenced, now marched through the streets with focused resolve. They held signs not just with names of the fallen, but with the faces of those who had betrayed them. No longer shouting into the void, the people were demanding systemic change backed by evidence, and this time the city could no longer look away. Tyrone never attended the trials. He didn't need to. He had done what he came back to do. Most days he spent in quiet repair, rebuilding the back porch, helping a neighbor patch up a roof, or simply sitting beside Alana as she read in silence, her head resting gently against his shoulder. They didn't talk about the baby often, but the pain had settled into something less jagged, something that lived between them, not as a wound, but as a quiet, sacred bond. The memorial in their yard remained untouched. The folded blanket never moved, the soil beneath it freshly turned once every month. Kenya kept working cases. She wasn't done. If anything, this had shown her how deep the roots went, how many others needed justice. She carried her cousin's memory into every interrogation room, every court filing. Moss was at her side through all of it, quieter now, but resolved. He had waited years for this storm to break. Now that it had, he wasn't letting the sun go down on it too soon. One evening, Alana stood by the window, watching the sun set behind the distant skyline. Tyrone approached from behind, placing a gentle hand on her back, and for a long moment they just stood there in silence, breathing in the stillness. "I'm not angry anymore," she said, her voice soft but clear. Tyrone nodded. "Neither am I." It didn't mean they had forgotten. It meant they had survived. And the city, for the first time in years, finally looked ready to remember. The morning air was cool but still, the kind of quiet that didn't demand words. Dew clung to the grass in soft beads, catching the early light in scattered fragments. Tyrone and Alana stood side by side before the small memorial stone, its edges worn smooth from the touch of time and rain. The blanket she had laid weeks ago remained folded at its base, undisturbed. Tyrone's hand rested gently in hers, fingers entwined not just in comfort, but in something deeper. Shared loss, shared endurance. Alana's eyes didn't blink against the wind as she reached up and placed her palm against his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat beneath her hand. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "It's over." Tyrone stood still for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the name etched in stone. His voice was low, measured, and not without grief. "No," he said softly, "but it's quiet now." They didn't stay long. They never needed to. The act of coming together, of standing as one before what they had lost, wasn't about ritual. It was about marking the space, reclaiming it from violence, from silence, from fear. They turned together, walking back toward the car without speaking again. What needed to be said had already been carried there in the weight of their silence. In the weeks that followed, the headlines continued. Kenya Rollins, after years of going unheard, was promoted to lead the newly formed anti-corruption task force, her name spoken now with respect instead of resistance. Moss submitted his retirement papers not long after, choosing peace while he could still enjoy it. He left with no press conference, no speech, just a box of files and a look in his eyes that said he had given enough. Cal, Mick, and Grady all faced federal indictments. Their mugshots flashed across news tickers, stripped of swagger and menace. Judge Raymond Culver was indicted last, his fall the most symbolic, the most bitter. He pled not guilty. No one believed him. The city didn't heal overnight. No streets were renamed, no grand statues erected. But the fear that had once crept beneath every interaction had started to crack. Meetings filled, petitions circulated, eyes stayed open. And slowly, block by block, the town began to shift. Not fixed, but exposed. And that, for now, was enough. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.